Thanks everybody for joining us today. I am Yvonne Brandon. I'm Chair of Public Schools First NC, and I'm joined today by Heather Coons, who is our Communication Director. And we are so proud and pleased to have Professor Derek Black with us today. Welcome, Derek. Today we're going to talk a little bit with Professor Black about his new book. But before that, let me give you a little introduction to Professor Black. He is a graduate of the UNC School of Law, so we're really proud that he's a product of North Carolina's law school, where he had his first opportunity to work on the Leandro case, which many of us are very, very familiar with. And he continues to support this work on Leandro even to this day. Professor Black is one of the nation's foremost experts in education law and policy. He is currently professor of law at the University of South Carolina Law School, and he there directs the Constitutional Law Center. He previously is the author of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. We actually feature this book and interview Professor Black, and I hope you'll go check that out on our YouTube. But this was an incredibly important book that analyzed the current assault on public education by those intent on undermining and destroying public education. And he talked about in that book how the constitutional promise to our children that they would have a free, high-quality public education is being undermined and actually ignored in many states across the country. So we're certainly feeling the impact of these kind of things today with the reinvigorated vouchers and the continued deep cuts to public education, not to mention the threats now of cutting the U.S. Department of Education. While these are really interesting and they're kind of related, but today we want to focus on the new book, Dangerous Learning, the South's Long War on Black Literacy, which documents the South's repression of Black education before and after the Civil War, providing a rich historical context for the hostility that currently is being faced by public school teachers, by curricula folks, and by libraries. So Derek, welcome to our conversation today. So I'm going to jump right in. In your new book, Dangerous Learning, you talked about how in the American South, one resource was probably more coveted and more contested than any other, and that was literacy. For Black citizens, it became a weapon of empowerment and rebellion, while for whites, it was the only tool they could use to destabilize the grip on the power. So when you started writing this book, tell your audience a little bit about how you and your career and your journey led you to writing this book or influenced your writing of this book.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure to be with you guys and all the great work you're doing. But I would say I've been doing education and civil rights work for my whole life, even if I didn't know it, sort of accidentally fall into it as often as not. I am a proud graduate of Clinton High School, Tennessee, which is the first traditionally white high school in the country to graduate an African American. Of course, I didn't know that history when I was coming up, but I came to learn it along the way. Then I go off to University of Tennessee, and for those who bother to read the prologue in Schoolhouse Burning, I accidentally find my way into an African American Studies class and go on to major with African American Studies in addition to some other things. And then, I looked around all the law schools in the country and loved the curriculum at UNC Chapel Hill, but I'll have to say the trees look like home, and so I came out of Chapel Hill and had some great mentors there who really set me on my way. People like Jack Boger to really help me build a career in education, civil rights, and racial equity. And so, I won't go through all the details, but I've been litigating, testifying, and writing about education equity for a long time, and slugging it out more often than not. And I finally thought I had gotten away from it. I got this story that I just sort of latched on to that I thought was going to give me some personal satisfaction and a moment of relief. And that was about secret schools during slavery. And I thought, let's just figure out what was happening in these and tell this sort of wonderful story of overcoming. And You know what? I fell my way into another modern story, which I didn't even intend to do. But what I found in researching those secret schools, secret black schools during slavery, was there was a much larger story there that started in 1820 and really just didn't stop. I mean, there's lots of peaks and valleys and twists and turns, but what I saw in the 30s and 40s was a South that was just censoring everything it could, repressing information, not just for Black people, but for white people as well, running faculty off at the University of Chapel Hill, um, putting out propaganda newspapers to try to create a new narrative. And it just sort of struck me that that paranoia over ideas, that paranoia over the possibility of equality, that paranoia over Black freedom has stuck with us for a long time. And of course, it's not the same after Reconstruction as it was during slavery, and it's not the same today as it was during Jim Crow. But man, there are a lot of echoes. There are a lot of just sort of emotional currents that seem to run through our culture that we just can't let go. And, they're back at us again, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for that. Your book is really such a fascinating history, taking us from pre-Civil War era up through today, and the efforts to, change resources for especially for Southern Black citizens. Can you take us back pre-Civil War and talk a little bit about how Black education and literacy really became a focus of the South's effort to stamp out the anti-slavery or the abolitionist movements?
Yeah, I mean, when you read the standard narrative or you read a Supreme Court case or the short versions of history, they always say that the South criminalized Black literacy. That's sort of start and finish. And so a lot of people walk around assuming that Black people never had access to reading and writing in the South, and that's just not true. And that was a discovery to me that we had a lot of schools, a lot of Black children, including enslaved children, that were going to school right out in the open in the late 1700s and early 1800s in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. But something changed in 1822, and that was Denmark Vesey, formerly an enslaved man himself, but really demonstrated the power of literacy, that he was able to reinterpret the Bible for himself. He was able to read congressional debates for himself. He was able to, write letters to foreign dignitaries. He was able to call upon the Declaration of Independence and a lot of these ideas that are really foundational to America. And he used those for Black freedom and ended up inspiring, some people say, several thousands of people to follow his lead into a revolt that got thwarted. But when it got thwarted, I think what the authorities in Charleston discovered was that Black literacy was dangerous and they needed to put a halt to it. Fast forward a few years after him, we have another man, David Walker, born free in Wilmington, North Carolina. Apparently had spent some time in Charleston and probably met Denmark Vesey, but he goes back to, or he ends up going north and living in Boston and writes the most radical document any Black American ever read, or at least or ever wrote, or at least anyone that the rest of society got a chance to look at. And it just sets the South on the white South on fire. They're so afraid of the ideas that he's releasing in that document that Georgia then criminalizes Black literacy and closes the port. North Carolina does it shortly thereafter. We top that off with Nat Turner, who also was highly literate and used his literacy skills in Virginia to lead a revolt. And at that point, the South goes from being one that's open to Black literacy, open to Northern newspapers, to one that says, no, we are going to close the curtain on open discussion, open thought, and ideas in the South. And since we're talking to a North Carolina audience, I mean, one of the things that really jumped out at me was that I want to say it was 1822. It was either 1822 or 1829. There were over 1,000 members of the North Carolina Anti-Slavery Society. Now, first of all, it's striking to me that there was even such a thing as an anti-slavery society uh, in the state of North Carolina, much less one with over 1,000 members, which really goes to this point of like the South had not radicalized in the way that we often think of the South. It hadn't radicalized in the early 1800s, but 8 years later, either after the 22 date or the 2029 date that I mentioned, only 12 people show up at the final meeting of the North Carolina Anti-Slavery Society. It was not safe for them to meet anymore. It wasn't safe for them to have their names on the rolls. And so you have a region that is trying to deal with serious problems and at least entertaining disagreement to one that violently and legally says we will have no disagreement in the South on certain things. And so I argue in the book that that the South seals its fate not when it signs, not when the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter, but when it closes the door on literacy and open debate in the late 20s and early 30s.
The leaders of our country really saw that, as I learned in your book, they saw that the lack of literacy among all citizens in the South really ended up being a problem. And can you talk a little bit about the context that led the Southern leaders, and particularly, the nation's leaders after the Civil War, to realize the importance of education, or the lack of education before the Civil War, and the harm that it had done to the citizens, and how that potentially contributed to factors leading up to the Civil War?
Yeah, well, number one, we go as far back as we want, but literacy is what I call freedom's line for Black people prior to the end of the Civil War, and then becomes, freedom's line into citizenship after the Civil War. So when you look at the Black community, they know exactly what they want, which is freedom through education, and they are the ones pushing for public education. But there's the other side of it, which you're getting at, Heather, which is, look, the South had done an abysmal job by its white children as well. That the Southern oligarchs and large plantation owners had absolutely no interest in a system of taxation that would require them to contribute to someone else's education, even if they're white children. So white illiteracy rates in the South were 4 times higher than in the North prior to the Civil War. Now, all that part is crystal clear. Now, where we could debate or speculate is how this society might have turned out differently had there been public education. Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, and some others would regularly say that, had the South been better educated, it never would have revolted. I don't know if that's true or not, but, their ideal was that you had a small fraction of plantation owners leading the South into a radicalized, point at which it couldn't turn back from. And it wasn't about the interest of regular, white students, but it was about the oligarchs and the slaveocracy. Again, how history would have turned out, I don't know. But what we do know is that Congress determined that a real democracy in the South would require a public education that was accessible to both poor white children and to Black children. And that's what they made happen.
Can you talk a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau and what its role was in growing educational opportunities for Southern Blacks?
Yeah, well, and for Southern whites as well. I mean, so the other part of this, and I wrote an essay about this recently, we've had all this discussion about, the federal role in education and the Department of Education being some, fantastical concoction of teacher unions to I don't know, to do whatever, in 79. And as I point out in another piece recently, that the Department of Education, the first Department of Education, was actually created in 1868 to get this public education project off the ground that we just talked about. And so Congress understood there needed to be a federal role. And it goes back to freedom for Black people and education for white people as well. But even before that, right, we had the federal military and the Freedmen's Bureau right? Literally building schools in the South, paying teacher salaries in the South when there were no other resources. And of course, it was the passion of Black communities that wanted those schools that filled them that was crucial. But, the Freedmen's Bureau, I think it spent like 80% of its budget or something like that on public schools, or freedmen schools as they called them. And but it really is instrumental in setting up the foundation from which a public education system grows. And without a Freedmen's Bureau bringing missionary teachers south to teach in those schools, without a Freedmen's Bureau identifying buildings and rehabbing buildings and building buildings and paying salaries, I imagine we would have had public education at some point in the South, but it would have been a much slower start than it was.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to the commitment to public education that our nation's leaders had, during that time. And to that, you are kind of touching on that. But after the Civil War, there were certain conditions that you talk about in your book that were placed on states for them to re-enter, for the states that had seceded to re-enter the Union, and for new states to become part of the United States. Can you talk a little bit about those and how they connect to this notion of public education?
Yeah, so once the South was seeking to re-enter the Union after the war, the question is, would they just be allowed freely back in, or were there terms to that? And Congress set three major terms. One was to ratify the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The second was to extend the right to vote to Black men in the South. And the third was to rewrite their state constitutions to conform to a Republican form of government. That concept of a Republican form of government, those explicit terms are in the United States Constitution. So what Congress is saying is bring your constitutions in conformity with the United States Constitution. And what Congress believed was that a Republican form of government was one that provided public education to its citizens. And so they gave states, they communicated that, right? That education had to be part of the plan. But towards the end of, well, not the end of Reconstruction, but that the first requirements went out in 1868. By 1870, Congress is getting a little bit nervous that some of the states might backtrack on their public education commitments. So the last three Southern states to enter the Union were Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi. And as to those three, the terms of their readmission explicitly state, you can look it up in the statute books now, explicitly state that they should never deprive any child of the school rights that they had just vested in their state constitution. So those state constitutional right to education becomes a federal mandate of being a state. And we see that after that point, no state, again, ever enters the Union without mandating public education in their state constitution. And I've told bits and pieces of this story in lots of places, but the short story here, or the basic concept, is that yes, our states do guarantee and provide education, but that's not happenstance that they do that. That structure, that guarantee is a function of Congress mandating it and pushing it forward. So I like to think of it more as or as I call it in one article, a constitutional compromise. We force you states to guarantee education in your own state constitutions, because that's what it means to be a democracy in the United States of America.
And yeah. So your book also discusses I'm going to go back a little bit to bring us forward, the South's efforts starting in the 1840s to control what was taught in schools. And you mentioned this earlier a little bit, but and I'm going to I'm going to read a quote from your book. So with the Southern Review pleading for school books to be free from objectionable matter, and the Quarterly Review also declared Northern textbooks not only offensive, but actually poisonous to the mind. So they were really pushing back on those. So I just want to bring you to forward. What parallels do you see in today's movement focused on curriculum today?
Well, yeah, Heather, I mean, the story you just told is the one where I finally felt like I'd fallen into this, modern trap again. I thought I was just a little passion project, and maybe I'm just dense. Maybe I wasn't making the connections early on, but when I saw these magazines, beginning to review Southern textbooks for Northern bias. And to be clear, I mean, the worst example or the best example, depending on your perspective, is one of those reviews was reviewing a geography book for Northern bias. And this is like a 2 or 3 page review. And it said that the book was not appropriate for use in Southern schools because it had devoted disproportionate attention to Northern crops. And I just thought, man, the paranoia is just off the charts. And it really is that paranoia that really struck me, right? Because what we are often fighting about with our curriculum and our textbooks aren't real historical points. They aren't sort of, what actually happened. It's this paranoia that there's some sort of conspiracy afoot, right, to undermine the status quo or to make white people feel bad. And that paranoia then leads itself to all sorts of illogical claims at times. And you see it with DeBoe's reviews there. I mean, if you can't talk about Northern crops, I mean, what else can you talk about?
Well, will you talk a little bit about what, like some of the paranoia that's happening right now where it's talking about, so in the 1840s, they were talking about the indoctrination, via these Northern ideas in our, down to the Southern schools and such like that. So what parallels do you see with some of the conversation happening now about the public schools indoctrinating students and things like that?
Well, you have two things going on. I mean, one of the things that came out of this paranoia period was the idea that we needed to have more flagship institutions in the South to produce more professors so that they could write Southern textbooks for Southern students from a Southern perspective. And you see governors who are saying, I want a different narrative of history, right? And they're turning to PragerU and others for that. They're not turning to the University of North Carolina for that, but maybe they wish they had it there. But you have Governor DeSantis, for instance, saying we're not going to use AP history standards to teach AP African American history, and we've had some of that here in South Carolina as well. We've had to sort of develop our own curriculums. I think it's still the same story, but the idea being that it's just this paranoia of outsiders, giving us the wrong version of history. So you see that now, and trying to fill it with other information. I mean, that's the part that really gets me. I mean, censorship is bad enough, and I'm not, suggesting we should censor things. But when you try to fill the silence with propaganda, I think that's when things get entirely out of control. Because now you're not just stopping stories, you're starting to perpetrate lies. And, that's what we see going on, right? I'm not accusing anyone of lying. That's not, but you see this sort of urge to silence one story and replace it with another. And what are we doing to vet that other story? And the answer is we're not. We're letting private parties just put another spin on history, one that's maybe politically palatable. And I want to be crystal clear on this. I think whether it's, the left or the right or the progressive or the whatever teacher, any of those groups that are trying to use our history curriculum or trying to use stories to achieve a political agenda is problematic. Right. I don't care whether it's left or right. And so I think that's one of the things that I really went to incredible pains in this book was to leave out the commentary. I mean, I've got a concluding chapter that tries to connect to today, to yesterday. I've got an introductory chapter that tries to do the same. But you look at those, whatever it is, 12 or 13 chapters that make up, the interior historical story of the book. I'm not engaging in commentary. I'm not spinning something to produce some outcome. And I think we all ought to take that lesson seriously, that the history is what it is. And in this book, I talk about the complexity of some of these slaveholders, that they're not actually all the same. I'm not saying any of them are saints. That's not, but it was sort of eye-opening to me to say, look, they're not all agreeing on everything, right? And by the same token, not all the abolitionists are agreeing on everything either. And it's a really rich story to see people grappling with real issues and debating them. And then, of course, we have repression and propaganda that overwhelms that story at some point, unfortunately, though.
Well, Derek, this has really been a fascinating conversation, but I'm going to kind of bring us to a close here. And one of the things I always like to do is to talk about what people now can do in the situation we're in. So, as you look at this tremendous amount of research you've done on this issue of public education and literacy, especially in the South, what lessons can we learn from today about what happens when you try to limit and diminish educational opportunities? What is the most effective way that advocates for a strong public education system, what could we be doing now? What should we be doing now? What lessons do you want us to learn and to use it to put forth a response to the attack on public education?
Well, I mean, look, one of the things I think we always have to do is try to find those things that we can agree on. I'm not one who thinks that everyone who disagrees with me is evil and trying to destroy the country. There's some people whose policies scare me, but I don't think that they're all evil. And so I do think there's a few things in here that are worth noting, right? Which is you think about this story of Black literacy and freedom through education, and I go, look, this is a timeless story. We're trying to connect it to something, but it's a timeless human story. I think anyone who has found themselves through reading, anyone who has, risen above their station in life through education. You read this book and you read the stories of Black people struggling for education, the overwhelming circumstances they overcome to learn during slavery, and you can't help but be inspired by the power of literacy itself. And so I think that's important for us to remember, that sort of human part of it. I mean, there's so many human stories in this book in which people are becoming more full versions of themselves through reading books. And so I just encourage people, first of all, to tap into that, because the flip side is that when you censor books, when you try to control the story that children get, what you're really doing is perverting their humanity. You're trying to pervert their humanity. And I think we all ought to be worried, of perverting children's humanity and their ability to become. And so I think that's just, something I hope we could all sort of agree on, that this is a process of self-discovery that we need to support children and not repress. The other part is the danger of polarization, I don't think anybody needs a lesson on that. But what you see in this book is how radical the South became when they started attacking ideas and literacy. And I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm not saying that the punchline here is we're heading towards civil war again, but we're really heading towards a place in which I don't think any of us, left or right, should feel comfortable living. Right? When we're always suspicious of each other, when we can't have discussions without, casting recriminations at one another, when we stop trying to find the right answer and we just start trying to share political talking points or serve political parties, I think we're in an incredibly dangerous place as society. I mean, you asked me about public education, and I'll end with this. I mean, public education for 2 centuries has been that place where we come together as communities. Not perfectly, right? We've got a history of segregation. We've got a history of gender discrimination. We've got a history of lots of bad things. But our public schools have marched hand in hand to create a bigger community, to create a bigger electorate, over the course of 2 centuries. Our public schools are part of Abraham Lincoln's words of a more perfect union, right? They are part of helping us get there. And I think everyone, hopefully, most of us have seen it that way. And if we destroy this common ground, if we destroy this area where maybe we disagree at the ballot boxes, but we can come together at the schools, and then I think this society can survive. This democracy can survive. But if we can't come together at the public schoolhouse, I really struggle to see how we move forward as a democracy that resembles anything like the one that I grew up in.
I don't think we could end on a more perfect summary of the crisis that many of us feel that we are facing. And it absolutely is true for most of us that we grew up in the public education system, that is where it was the heartbeat of our community. It was the cornerstone of our community. It's where, our favorite people worked, our teachers, right? It was where teachers were revered and where the economy of the community centered around the schools, the public schools, and especially the high school, right? So I think you really given me pause to think about how we kind of reconnect the emotional feeling that we've all had about the value of in America, that we say that everybody is entitled to a free, high quality public education, and how we kind of can get a way back to getting folks to join around that common public good is the challenge that is before us. And I do want to say, thank you so much. I always feel so much better informed, and when I talk with you or hear you talk, I always leave with questions that I want to find out more about, and I hope that everybody will read your book. It is incredibly important. I hope they'll also take a few minutes to go find Schoolhouse Burning, because it taught me so much about constitutional law around public education, and things that I really did not know. And finally, to all our listeners, I hope you will join us in this fight to protect public education as the cornerstone of our communities, our democracy. And we are truly on the verge of tearing down a critical part of our democracy, and restoring it may be impossible. We don't know. But I do hope that everybody will listen to what Professor Black said, that this is something that we can reconnect with each other in our community and restore and fight to keep. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Another wonderful conversation.
Thank you.